I'm Todd Crawford,
I'm Eric Zavinski.
and we are too cool for the comic shop. Tonight, we're too cool for the record store, actually. And we're talking about a popular band that I think is from Boise, Idaho, by the name of Mighty Mouse.
Mighty Ducks, Mighty Mice.
Yeah.
What's in a name? Yeah, no, we're here to talk about Modest Mouse, something Todd knows very little about. Not the band, but Modesty, of course. We decided, you know what, why not start a bunch of spin-offs? Even we've done movies and TV shows and comics and video games. Why not music? So here we are talking about an alternative rock band we both know some knowledge for. So, Odd. You know their music a little bit more intimately than I do. So why don't you go into your introductions with the band?
Yeah, so personally, I remember when they were getting ready to release the album Strangers to Ourselves. I remember seeing a video for Wolves for some reason on my desktop computer in my bedroom when I was in high school. And
it was Coyotes, Todd.
Coyotes, gosh. Yeah. And they had the big song, of course, Float On. And I was never really interested. Float On put me off, and that was basically it for a long time. But then around 2016, I was really into Built to Spill, which is now basically my favorite modern act. And of course, Modest Mouse and Built to Spill toured together. Built to Spill influenced a lot of Modest Mouse. Even the music video for Built to Spill song Car is on the Modest Mouse YouTube for some reason. And so I thought I was going to give it a try because there's a lot of overlap and interest. So I got This Is a Long Drive and The Lonesome Crowded West and listened to them. And I was working overnight at a loading dock at that point, and I'd listened to those albums a lot, pretty much every night. Then I added the Moon and Antarctica, and those were all I listened to pretty much, aside from a few B-sides or other releases, up until just past month or so. I gave their next 3 albums a shot. So that's basically my history with them.
Excellent. Funny because we do have a similar jumping on point for the band. I was actually introduced to the band because a YouTuber, somebody who vlogs that I've been watching for years, he actually did a guitar cover of Coyotes from Strangers to Ourselves. I thought that song was really nice and cute. So I looked at the music video for that and just kind of fell into the hype for that album back in 2015 when I was in college. So I ended up buying that album, loving that album a lot. So I actually got introduced, and that's still their latest album, even though it was 6 years ago. So I got introduced to Modest Mouse pretty much just on that last album alone for a few years. One of my favorite alt rock albums of the past few years. And then I ended up realizing, like, oh, wait, this is the same band that did Float On, because, like, everyone knows that song. And then I ended up looking through some of their music videos and just really being engaged by how wacky some of them are. But it really wasn't until prepping for this podcast that I looked at their entire discography, because I know they've been around for a while. Their first album was in 1996. So they've been around for 24, 25 years. Actually, I think they were a band for a few years before they even had an album released. So I wanted to check out more of their music, and I figured, hey, the podcast with you would be a good time to do that. I think you had posted on Facebook about listening to their music and being inspired by the lead singer, Isaac Brock. He had a speech impediment, and he ended up being a lead singer of a rock band. So that's a pretty cool fun fact. And then you and I were like, hey, we both listen to this band. Why don't we just talk about it on the show? Because anything we have in common, we're just going to talk about it on the show eventually.
Yeah, exactly. At some point, it's going to be an episode on our favorite brands of tea. If we keep it going long enough.
Right? I'm down for that.
In about 30 years,
We'll
there's
just
going to be an episode, top 10 ranked worst youngsters we can't get off our lawn.
Yeah, we're just gonna have to abbreviate the show for real and just call it Too Cool because we can't describe it with any other words at that point.
Yeah, because the dementia will
There'll be no
set in.
comics or shops involved. Every piece of pop culture would have already been dissected. So we'll just have to talk about like oatmeal or something.
Yeah, so you just want to start from... I'm just going with their full albums. Those are the only ones I've heard in full, to be completely transparent. I've heard individual tracks off
fair.
the other releases.
I was looking through YouTube Music, and they have several EPs, a couple compilation albums of like unreleased material, and a live album. Live album, by the way, is called Baron Von Bullshit Rides Again, which I think is probably one of the best titles for an album ever. But yeah, we'll stick to the 6 main album releases the band had, just for our sake, your sake, as a viewer.
Yeah, so the first main release is This Is a Long Drive for Someone with Nothing to Think About. And I have to say, as much as I like the album, it shares one thing in common with its name, being that they're both a little bit long in the tooth.
Yes. It's a very hard album title to remember. It's like 10 words long.
And it's funny because I've known it for years. I'm bad with titles in general, but it just doesn't, with Nothing to Think About for some reason, just does not roll off the tongue easy for me.
Oh, it does. I don't think it does for me or probably anybody, brother, because it is. I think it's kind of the point is that it's a meandering like 12-word title of an album, and most of what this album deals with, and what my music brain can decipher is basically it's easy to just kind of ramble on and just think about random crap and nothing of much importance. And it's apparently about them growing up in rural America and being lonely, existential.
Yeah, I feel like this album particularly is very much so first album in that it seems like they had been touring for a while. They had put together some songs, and basically they just throw it all together onto an album. It doesn't feel to me like there's much structure or overlapping storytelling like the other albums typically are. They feel more composed. There seems to be an order to the tracks. Some of them do, like Dramamine is very much so a track one, and you get that vibe from it. And I think that Make Everyone Happy, Mechanical Birds, a penultimate track, is very much an album closer, even though there is one short track after it. But it seems like songs slapped together. That's not a criticism. It actually makes it feel very charming in the way that it feels almost like a mixtape or something that you would have on in the car. And I think even though they are individually collected tracks, I think they do feel cohesive for the most part. It has a vibe, even if it may not have much, in my opinion, structure. And I think it, for the most part, flows pretty well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's not necessarily all music that was recorded at the same time either, because they had been making songs for like 3 years before this. So it definitely has that vibe, but I think the thematics of like the album cover and just kind of the meandering through country roads just kind of fits the motif of the songs are kind of meandering from idea to idea, and there's not really too much of a connecting thread.
One thing I have to say, I'm looking at the Wikipedia for this because I'm really bad with song titles, especially for these albums. Because what I would do is I would put them on at work, I'd click play, and then I wouldn't get to look at them because I was working. So I know, like, I can remember the guitar parts, but I may not know the name. But I'm just realizing that one of my favorite Modest Mouse songs, Edit the Sad Parts, is on the vinyl release of this album. That kind of makes me sad it didn't make the cut for the main album. I mean, it's a 7-minute track, and this album is 74 minutes long, I'm seeing. But that would have been nice to have in there, I think.
Yeah, I don't think I've heard that song because of that, because I've been listening to them on YouTube Music, and I can't see that track on here.
So some of the standout tracks for me on this album, and I guess this is kind of just a recap of each one. This one, I feel like there's just a little bit less meat to dig into, even than the other albums, even some of the ones I don't like as much as this one particularly. This isn't my favorite Modest Mouse album, but it's one of the ones I find the hardest to talk about because of it just being what it is. I mean, there's clearly very strong musicianship. I think that Isaac Brock's songwriting is at this age already very clever and witty. I think that he does sharpen it. But really, it just seems like a very promising rock band. Once again, very much in that Boise, Idaho sound. And it's really just a very energetic, fun album that's great to throw on in the car. But some of my favorite tracks are going to be Dramamine, of course, Tundra Desert, and Making Everybody Happy, Mechanical Birds. To go for 3, those are probably the 3 I would choose. But Custom Concern, of course, is always a favorite too for me.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of cool because Dramamine I never knew was one of their first sons or the leading track from their first album.
Have you ever seen the video for it?
What's that?
Have you seen the video for it?
I probably have, but not recently.
If it's an official video, I could just be mistaken, but that's actually how I saw it and what got me into the band was that song and video. It's very 90s. It's like an animated thing. Once again, I was really into that kind of like punk prog kind of weird Built to Spill sound at the time. So that particular track was just exactly what I was into at that point in time. And I mean, I still am, but you know, Dinosaur Jr., shit like that. So that's actually the song that gave me the thought to give the band a second chance.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And it's still one of their most popular songs, and that's why I didn't realize how old it was, because it was kind of ranked with some of their newer songs when you like look up their singles. I still think that's probably the strongest song from the album. And I really listened to this album for like the first time today, so I didn't really have like super strong affinities for many of the tracks, because like as much as they are very different songs that might not always fit together structure wise, what you said, the vibe is very much kind of similar. I just kind of let the songs play, and I wasn't really exactly always sure when each song was changing as well, especially because some songs are like minute 30 seconds, and then the next song is like 7 minutes, and then there's a 4 minute, and then there's a 2 minute. I think of all their albums, this has the most variety of song length as well.
Probably. This album has a lot of variety in general. I will say the lowest point in the album for me is the first like 15-20 seconds of Beachside Property. I just find it irritating, and it actually kind of reminds me of a song by the band Pavement, which I guess you could also recommend to fans of Modest Mouse on the Slanted and Enchanted album. I don't remember the specific track it reminds me of, but I listen to both those albums a lot at the same time, and yeah, the opening of Beachside Property, even though I like that song, just has always irritated me to the point where I'd even skip the track sometimes listening to it. I'd take my MP3 player in my pocket at work to skip it because I just could not stand that opening draw.
Yeah, I feel like there are a few Modest Mouse songs that do that, to be honest, that kind of have that drawl or that, you know, that irritating kind of noise for 15 or so seconds, and then they like go into the real part of the song. Or they are like, a couple albums have songs that are like 15 seconds long that are basically just weird intros to like better full song.
Yeah, and I think for the most part, the band does it very well.
I don't have an opinion of those, but they're really harmless, so it is what it is.
Yeah, I think like the band is interesting because I think they're irritating. I think Isaac Brock's voice is irritating. I think some of the lyrics can be irritating. The song length can be irritating, but it's part of the character and charm of the band. Is it almost feels like you have a buddy over to drink, and you get along well. You like their stories. They're clever. They're funny. There's so much personality, but there's also weird quirks too that can be grating if you're in the wrong mood. And I say that with complete affection. I'm not saying it's irritating in a negative way, if that makes sense. But if I played it, some of the songs on this album for someone, and they said they could not stand it, it hurt their ears, even though I love it, I totally understand why it would have that effect on someone.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think everything from what you said, the weird sound choices they sometimes make, and then also, yeah, lead singer's voice is very much an acquired taste. Like, I obviously liked it. It's got kind of a cross between some sort of 90s punk grunge, but also very much just kind of like his voice sounds very unique. It's hard to describe. It's kind of gravelly, also high pitched sometimes. He's got range. I don't know how else to describe his voice, but it's very much Modest Mouse, and I don't think they're going to be one of the more popular alt rock bands beyond their singles, just because of those things that make them really distinct.
Yeah, I think the big thing that I think makes their earlier stuff at least not as prominent is just the song lengths, the experimentation. I mean, some of the stuff's pretty jammy in some regards, and that's what I love about it. That's my favorite stuff they do. But I think it's more off-putting than something like, I don't know, I'm just throwing a random example out there, but something like Fall Out Boy or something. I mean, Fall Out Boy is and always has been basically a pop band in the sense that it's very accessible. It's verse, chorus. It's they've always been trendy and all that. I don't really follow their career. I just have known enough people who did that I've absorbed it. But they were built to be accessible, and that's not slamming them. That's just what they do. Whether you think it's good or bad, is just opinion. But Modest Mouse, on the other hand, is kind of it's more alternative. I mean, it's going for a specific thing that isn't always radio friendly.
Yeah, and they explore a lot musically, and I just kind of get the vibe that they are more interested in kind of exploring their own feelings and their own themes without really giving a crap about what other people think. And they didn't really become popular until halfway through their albums, their music careers. So I think that pretty much is what makes them still an indie band. And even when they became more mainstream, they still kind of feel that way. Kind of the vibe that they give me. I don't really have much else to say about the first album, so if you want to move on to the Lonesome Crowded West, their sophomore album, I can do that.
Yeah, no, this is the album for me I've listened to the most. This is my favorite of their discography. I guess I will give a rating to, no, I'll just do it at the end. We can rate them all at the end real quick.
Yeah, that sounds good, or at least maybe rank them, at the very least.
Yeah, so this album is, in my opinion, very much so a concept album. And to the point where I actually based a lot of the character and the triptych of books that I recently completed on this character that I thought the album's portraying, not directly, but the way that the lyrics characterize somebody, I kind of took a lot of inspiration from and listened to a lot, which kind of pisses me off because sometimes people think it's just me, and it's like there's so much shit that's the direct opposite, where it's like, no, I'm just ripping off Modest Mouse and some other groups. But this album is very influenced by Bob Dylan. And I think that comes out quite a bit. I think you do hear some Bob Dylan there. I think it has a very strong sense of location, which is apt for the title Lonesome Crowded West. And what's so funny to me, though, is that, like I said, I always thought that this was much more satirical than the album actually is. I never realized it was as autobiographic as it is, or that it's as I guess you could just say like more straightforward emo. I always thought it was much more kind of satirizing those things. And the producer, who did I think 3 or 4 tracks on this album, Teeth Like God's Shoe Shine, Doing the Cockroach, Cowboy Dan, and I think Trailer Trash were the tracks produced by him. There's a really good documentary Pitchfork did on the album, about 40 minutes long, where they break all this down. But the track Cowboy Dan, the producer Phil Leck thought was a jokey thing, but it was actually just the name of Isaac Brock, someone that I think his father was friends with. It was this person's nickname. He just found it interesting, And that sums up so much the album. I think some of the appeal of it in the band is that it's quirky, it's kind of funny, but yet it's also sincere and earnest.
Oh, I completely agree with that. A hobby, fun and quirky song titles in the business, and it usually extends to their lyrics as a whole. But even if you've not heard the music, just like here's 3 songs in a row is Teeth Like God's Shoe Shine, Heart Cooks Brain, Convenient Parking. Those are 3 song titles in a row, and they don't have seemingly anything to do with each other as part of the sincerity of what they're doing here. Oh, and Jesus Christ Was an Only Child is after that.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the album is that so much of it's based on small town America being consumed and swallowed whole by strip malls and basically the plot of every Disney movie where someone's going to put a mall in instead, in the small town and ruin it. And it's a very emotional look at that from the perspective of a young man, I guess you could say, that lives in a trailer park, which is such a fascinating idea for an album to me.
Where is Modest Mouse's Disney movie then, by the way? You gotta get that on Disney Plus.
It sounds like it. I mean, it's the House of Mouse. You think they could extend a contract.
Very, very good connection. I approve.
Getting right into the track list, I mean, Teeth Like God's Shoe Shine is definitely one of their strongest openers, if not their strongest, I think.
It's definitely distinct. I personally don't like the sound of this album very much. I think it's kind of where the band is most irritating sounding, as we talked about earlier, to me. So I was listening through some of these tracks and I was just like, oh, I can't do it anymore. So I kind of skip around and things like that. It's just funny because this is your favorite album. So look how subjective music is. I think some of my more favorite songs were in the Cockroach and Cowboy Dan, which is funny because apparently a couple of my favorites are some of the ones that the producer was working on that more heavily.
Yeah, I think Cowboy Dan builds tension in the song very well, and there is some parts where it breaks down, you go into guitar solos and stuff, but a lot of it isn't really. It's kind of this like thumping beat and repetition of lyrics and storytelling. And I think it works really well at creating this atmosphere and this character. It's very simple, but it feels almost like a folk tale or a legend or something.
Right.
And before I get sidetracked, I think Teeth Like God's Shoe Shine, the end guitar bit, the pinch harmonics especially, just some of my favorite bits pretty much ever. I mean, it's probably the hardest track on the album. I mean, it just begins very explosively with shouting and everything, but especially once it gets into the solos at the end, it really, I think, it takes off.
Right. I think this album probably does have more shouting, more jarring sounds than I think the other 5 albums do, and maybe that's part of what kind of put me off to it when I was listening to it. But you've also listened to it a lot, you said. You know where the good bits are and when to hype yourself up for them. It sounds like I need to give like Teeth Like God's Shoe Shine like a full shot, because I don't think I listened to the full 7 minutes of it, unfortunately.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, it's definitely a song that pays off, I think. And it is a jarring opening too. Even for the band knowing what to expect with them, I think it's, even having heard their entire discography, I think it's still one of their weirdest tracks, vocally especially. I don't think that there's ever quite the same kind of vocals in the rest of the discography. I'm sure that there's examples proving me wrong, but I don't think there's any other song, not just from this band, but many others that sound quite like it. I think it is something pretty much wholly unique. I think the last bit of the album I really like a lot. The final track reminds me quite a bit of Fugazi, actually, and I do think there's a lot of Ian MacKaye influence on this album. I think there's a lot of Fugazi in there, but Polar Opposites, Bankrupt on Selling, and Styrofoam Boots is just a great way to close out the album, and I think that I think it's Polar Opposites. It's one of my favorite drinking songs. I don't really get to drink anymore because of my medication that much, but it's got a line in it. I'm trying to drink away the time of the day I can't sleep away, or something like that. And it's always a fun song to drink to.
Yeah, that's why I felt like this album was getting a lot more chill in the last few songs of the album. So I can imagine that it's better for that setting.
Definitely. And lots of like Bankrupt on songs, very interesting, talking about angels selling things and all that, and lyrics like teeth like God's shoe shine. A big part of this album, I think, that's starting to emerge is Isaac Brock. I believe he was raised into a cult or something weird, so he's a very staunch atheist, but he's still using this kind of Christian lore to tell his stories, even though it's always very kind of anti-religious or speculative at the very most positive it even approaches. And it just adds even more to this kind of roadmap kind of thing that they have going with these albums, where it really it's just such a unique perspective and appropriation of these themes, I think, that I've never really seen another songwriter do quite the same.
Yeah, I think Modest Mouse does that throughout a lot of their albums, kind of using Christianity and religion and allegory to kind of bolster their lyrics. They talk about fruit a lot, and you can see that in one of their earlier EPs, and then string that all the way through their career and into their final album so far. And they kind of, use those recurring images to evoke privilege, or to evoke something that we're seeking in this life. Whether it's, trying to use the planet or our designs, like it is in the Strangers to Ourselves album, or just I don't know, they use a lot of that kind of imagery that I think that similarly to what the Bible would do, and they've been doing that for a long time. So that's something that struck me listening to their early work, is that what they did in 2015 is some of the stuff that they've been doing in the mid-90s as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the best bits of storytelling on this album is Trailer Trash, which is kind of the obvious thing to say, but it's because it's just an incredible song.
All right. It's got a lot of lived-in feeling to this album. It seems like that of all the albums, it's the most, you said, autobiographical, at least for Isaac, and what it was like growing up in that kind of environment.
Yeah, and I had read that, I don't know if it was around this time or before or after, but he had been in a drinking and driving incident and spent some time in jail for it. And some of the lyrics on it, like I mentioned, Polar Opposites are long distance drunk and all that. It's interesting. It's just a very, you never really know how much of it is the songwriter and how much of it is the human being, in my opinion. And usually I feel like I can get a pretty decent grasp on that. But it's very universal, but yet hyper specific.
Exactly. I think that's kind of what this band does well at their best, is that it's always very descriptive and always very detailed. But the underlying themes of the songs and the feelings of them are very much general angst that I think a lot of people can relate to.
Well, are we ready to go on to the next album, The Moon and Antarctica?
Yeah, the Moon and Antarctica, which I have a hunch might be kind of where our interests in the band's different types of music kind of intersect. It seems like you're more of an early Modest Mouse guy, and I'm more of a later Modest Mouse guy, and this is their third album of 6. So this is my favorite album that we've discussed so far. So I know this is for you, the third of the Holy Trinity for you as well.
Yeah, I would say, so the 3 albums that we've discussed so far, including this one, of course, I would say are about at the same level of quality, with This Is a Long Drive personally being my least favorite. This album I really love, and always didn't want to get too far into Modest Mouse discography. And this, I believe, is their first big major label album. But they use the budget so well, where they increase the amount of string sections, which were sparingly used on the past albums. I don't know if at all on This Is a Long Drive. And it's a very Pink Floyd inspired album. Even the cover, where it's two hands shaking in the skies, kind of reminiscent of Wish You Were Here's album cover. And it's a very spacey album, very just ambitious songwriting, and it's not quite as heavy as the other two albums, but the instrumentation is just as experimental and diverse and rewarding, I think.
Right. And another fact that I'm not sure if you saw is that the title is actually based off of a newspaper headline from the Blade Runner movie, where it read, "Farming the Oceans, the Moon, and Antarctica." So I'm not sure if you knew that, but I thought that was very interesting.
No, I didn't. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And that just kind of gets into the general kind of aesthetic of the album. I think the Lonesome Crowded West did it first, where the general aesthetic was kind of that suburban angst. But this aesthetic is a lot of the same kinds of feelings and topics, but it's kind of blown up onto an astronomical proportion, where they use planets and gravity and black holes to kind of describe a lot of these feelings that they're describing here.
Yeah, this album actually reminds me quite a bit of the album The Story Is in the Soil by Bright Eyes. In terms of the different instrumentation, in terms of just the structure of the album, how sprawling and long it is. Of course, the folk and country inspiration as well as mixing it with other genres. But one of the most interesting things to me that I have to bring up, because I've been listening to this album quite a bit lately. I found it on sale just at Barnes & Noble for like $3. And at the end of A Different City, I believe it is, which is kind of like a faster paced song, it basically just comes to a crashing end, and then it plays on repeat part of a later track on the album on like a bit of a loop that eventually breaks and then plays through, and it's just like a 10-second thing, and it's clearly distorted, even though you can make out what's being said, but it feels as though you're getting some weird out of sync message from the future of the album or something. And it's just such a specific touch that you would think would add very little or nothing to the album. It doesn't even quite make sense, even having heard the album so many times. But it's so immaculate and perfect. And it's one of my favorite things that the band's ever done, is just that little touch.
No, that sounds like a good kind of re-listen value, because I didn't catch that, but I know kind of using the sound leitmotif, not just track to track, but like, what is it, like several tracks apart that they do this?
Yeah, it's not one song leading into the other. It's one song that basically foreshadows a song coming 4 or 5 later.
Well, that's excellent. Yeah. Which that in and of itself, A Different City, is kind of like the immediate sequel to the Tiny Cities Made of Ashes, where they're very contrasting sounds. I believe the Tiny Cities was a lot slower, and the Different City ramped it up. It's very much automatically, very instantly different.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that this album, they focus a lot more on the rhythm section than the others. There's a lot more acoustic tracks, that there's a lot more going on. It's a much richer soundscape.
Yeah, I think there's more melodies in this album specifically compared to like their first 2 albums.
Yeah, so
like you said, they had a much higher production producer and a much higher budget as well.
Yeah, and what's great is that it feels very much like the same band. It's just the same band that's a little bit older, a little bit more experienced. And I'm not saying the instrumentation's better on this album. It's just different, but it's the same level of quality. It's not better, it's not worse, in my personal opinion. But you're just seeing a band mature in the best way possible, and seeing success and seeing an increase in budget, an increase in probably time to write songs and everything, and just using it to the absolute best that you could hope for.
I completely agree. What are some of your favorite tracks from the album? Because I think this album starts off very strong as well. Where Third Planet and Gravity Rides Everything are two of my favorites from the album.
Those are definitely two good ones. I mean, Third Planet for me would always come on because on my old MP3 player, this album came on after another one I listened to a lot. I don't remember which one, and sometimes it'll get stuck on a track, and I have to restart it to listen to other songs. And Third Planet's one of the tracks that my MP3 player gets stuck on, which is just kind of one of the things that always sticks with me with it. But it's a very strong opener for me personally. I would say that it might just be my favorite Modest Mouse song is The Stars Are Projectors, actually. Is probably my favorite on the... Well, it is definitely my favorite on the album. I almost wish, even though I do like the final part of the album, I almost wish it ended with The Stars Are Projectors. But that one is by far my favorite on this album, and probably just my favorite song they've done.
Yeah, it is a very good one. I think it's one of those long Modest Mouse songs that is really good for me all the way through. And it's like a 9-minute song, so that is pretty awesome. Yeah, I kind of agree with you too. It almost feels like the last third of the album after that was kind of not necessarily an afterthought, but more like the tracks that were recorded last, and they were not as cohesive with like the theme of the album. Still good music, but I kind of see what you're saying there.
Yeah, I don't even think it's like a drop in quality or anything. It's just that, being the longest track in the album, you almost, in it being the 9th track on the album, you kind of expect it to be the last. So it took me a while to really accept the other tracks because it was just such a strong way. Like, it's like a show when it's like it ends a season, you're like, it's perfect, I don't need any more. Then it goes on for another season, and it's still good, but it had the perfect opportunity to end.
Right.
And some of my favorite tracks that come after that, I think Wild Packs of Family Dogs is great. Very much in the style of Trailer Trash. Paper Thin Walls, Life Like Weeds, the whole thing. I mean, it's really just a very consistent album. If there was one flaw, it's not even a flaw of it, but compared to the other two albums, I think there's less standout tracks on this album. And I think it's, it flows together more. This one feels much more, even though it's, I think, less of a concept album than The Lonesome Crowded West. I think this one, you can listen to individual tracks, or you cannot listen to individual tracks quite as much. You almost have to listen to this album in full every time.
Right. I think maybe not the writing. Lonesome Crowded West is very cohesive, but I think maybe musically it kind of all flows together a bit more in this one.
Even stuff like, I'm looking at the track list right now, I'm like, track 4, Perfect Disguise, and how it flows in with track 12, I Came as a Rat, thematically and all that. And like I said, the previews of other tracks and everything in that nature, I think the band really, that is the biggest step forward for the band, is that. And this is an hour-long album. So there was, I forget who did the review, it was probably Pitchfork, where they said, every Modest Mouse album is 15 minutes too long. And I think at this point in the band's career, it's still pretty much true, but they're getting there in terms of structuring an album.
Right. They also only make an album, especially in the second half of their career, like every 5 to 8 years. So I feel like they end up having longer albums, sometimes rather than more. Because if you look at their albums, most of them are 15 or so songs, some of which have 9-minute songs. Whereas I feel like a lot of alt rock bands usually around the 10-song mark, especially these days.
Yeah, exactly. And that gets into their influence on other bands. Like, for instance, the band Brand New was very influenced by Modest Mouse. They toured together, and they postponed one of their albums quite a few, I think it was like 10 years or something outrageous, And there's a lot of speculation it was because of the negative reception of some of Modest Mouse's later albums after they had taken so long to make them, and then fans weren't as receptive. But
Interesting.
I think with Modest Mouse, not with Brand New, but with Modest Mouse, I think that you get your weight's worth.
Right. I don't think they're a band that you can really kind of hype yourself up for and be like, oh, they're going to release an album this year. I kind of did that in 2019. They released a few singles, which I thought were like leading up to an album. It did not lead up to an album. They just had a few singles in 2019. So if they do make another album, you know, there might also be another 8-year gap. So just kind of have to be joyous when it does come, but don't expect it, kind of thing.
Yeah, I didn't even know about those singles. I'll have to check those out tomorrow. At
Yeah,
this point for
Poison
me,
in the Well is really good, and I'd have to re-listen to a couple of the other singles from that year. But yeah, that's their newest music, is a few singles from like 2 years ago.
at this point for me, by the year 2000, I would say if they just retired, they paid their fucking dues. Like, they could rest on their laurels as far as I'm concerned. Like you said, if they release new music, I'll be happy. But those 3 albums alone for me, and I do like the others, but even if they didn't make the others, I mean, they have more great tracks and more accomplishments than people get in 50-year careers, you know?
Right. Especially for bands these days that don't really kind of have the legacy of rock bands. I feel like rock is alt rock in the past couple decades. It's just kind of looked at in a different way. But I think compared to most bands in the genre, they've definitely held their own, especially impressive because there's not a lot that keeps them in the limelight anymore either.
Yeah, well, are you ready to go on to the next album, Good News for People Who Love Bad News?
Yes, which is, coincidentally talking about Limelight. This is their most famous album, with a couple of their most famous singles as well. And it's funny because I think I had heard the like hip hop inspired version of Float On, which is The Show Goes On. Lupe Fiasco is a real song. Look it up. It's literally the same beat and rhythm of Float On, but it is a hip hop R&B version.
I think
so.
Danny Brown also has a song called Float On, which I don't know if they sample it or not. I don't remember. It's been years since I've heard that track, but it was definitely inspired by it.
That's very interesting. It's kind of hard not to talk about this album without talking about Float On, so I guess we can just get that over with. I love Float On. It's a really good song. It's kind of interesting because it very much sounds like a pop song, but also with like the cells or the atoms of like a normal Modest Mouse song made for radio. I don't know if that's kind of like how it makes you feel.
Yeah, I mean, I never used to care for the song when I was younger, and I listened to it recently. It just came on like a playlist or something. I wasn't listening to the band or the album, and what shocked me was that, like you said, I mean, it's very much a pop song, but yet the production, the instrumentation, everything, despite being a pop song, was unmistakably Modest Mouse. And
right.
They use certain like sound effects and stuff they use on earlier albums, but yet they completely repurpose it for this radio pop track. And I think it works really well. It's very anthemic. It's a really good song, and sometimes things are popular because they're good. And I think this is a case where it is it's earned its place in the radio rotation. I think it is that good.
Right. No, I absolutely agree. And, I don't think I actually really gravitated toward the song when it came out. I was pretty young. But, like, going back and listening to it, like, I can totally see this being popular in 2004.
Yeah, it definitely has it. I think they even did a Kids Bop version, if I'm not mistaken. I will say, though,
right.
For me, as much as I do appreciate that track now, The World at Large is probably one of my favorite songs they've done. And I mean, the horn intro, I mean, that's an interlude. I'm not going to count that as an actual track. It's 9 seconds long.
Right.
The Word at Large for me is just a perfect introduction to the album. And just,
I agree.
Yeah, it's just 10 out of 10.
Very
It
much
hypes
set
me
the
up every
tone.
time. It has such a great mood. It's just an amazing track.
Absolutely. I really think this album kind of front loads its awesome songs. Because I really like The Ocean Breeze Salty as well. Very manic, upset song. That is kind of a good follow up to Float On, I think.
It is, and it's funny because it's a single. Once again, these are 3 singles here, but all 3 are very different tracks. And I think Ocean Breeze Salty might have the best lyrics on the album. Some of it, I think there's ones that just very just witticisms essentially, and just very typical Isaac Brock songwriting. Really good stuff. And I will say I listened to this album probably 3 or 4 times before I liked it, because I liked the first track, World at Large, and Float On I grew to appreciate, but I really didn't care for much of the album because it has almost nothing I liked on the old albums.
Right.
But after hearing with repetition, I started to realize that I liked it in its own right. And the strongest point of the album for me is I think that this has the best vocals in their discography. I think that Brock is just going absolutely wild in it. It is his most outrageous performance. Stuff like This Devil's Workday is absolutely crazy. Dance Hall, which is probably my least favorite track on the album. It's just nuts. It's just him totally embellishing, almost the point of parody, his character vocally. And 99% of the time it works incredibly well for having such a weird voice and stretching it as much as he does on this album. It's really impressive to me, and it carries the whole fucking album. And the instrumentation's good, the songwriting's good. I'm not dissing it. I like the album a lot now that I've heard it many times, but by far the highlight of it for me is the lyrics and the vocals this time around.
Yep, I agree with that. I also agree with your point about Dance Hall. Dance Hall is like the only song that I feel myself have the urge to skip when I listen to this album.
100%.
I mean, I like respect it, but it's also like I feel like he's like right in my brain, like screaming at me for 3 minutes. It's like a lot. It's a lot to take. Being said, kind of similar to the last album, I really like the last 3 tracks of the album too. I feel like Black Cadillacs, One Chance, and The Good Times Are Killing Me all kind of flow well into each other and kind of help simmer you down as the album's coming to a close. It actually helped me relax quite a bit when I was listening to those again today.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one thing that's good about this album is that even though you don't have an 8-minute track or anything on this one, each song has something distinct that separates it from the others. It's a very colorful album. And, for instance, like, let me see here. I think The View could be compared to One Chance in terms of just the general tone, but they're nothing alike. I think that the singles, once again, nothing. I think Bury Me With It's kind of like Black Cadillac, but you'll never mistake one song for the other.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think overall it's definitely, I think it is an album kind of made more for the mainstream, and it was pretty successful in that regard. But really just kind of very small concessions, I think, made for the mainstream. Like not having a 10-minute song. But still, you got some 4-minute songs. You've got weird little interludes and lots of, Isaac Brock vocalizations and jarring instruments. So they still keep most of the same identifying factors of the band, but I think they just kind of like truncate some of it to make it more appealing to a wider audience.
Yeah, and it feels like more of a natural evolution once again. I mean, they were kind of getting softer with each album to some extent. I mean, Lonesome Credit West might be a little bit heavier than Long Drive, but they're both about on par. And they kind of softened up with each album since up till this point. I do think that changes a bit with the next album, but it feels like a natural continuation. It is more radio friendly. It is more mainstream, but it's still some of the band's strongest songwriting. I think it has some of the most memorable lyrics. I think it's got some of the best performances of their career. And I'll say this, I think it is by far the tightest album they've released in terms of structure alone. This is the one album that they've released pretty much ever that I would say that I could listen to in full. And even though I don't like dancehall, it never feels like it overstays its welcome. It's not my favorite, but it is the most concise and the best structured.
Right. Well, if it's one bad song, it's smack dab in the middle of the album. It's only 3 minutes long.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I can agree with that. I feel like other albums are kind of like too heavy on one end and they're like lopsided. But I would agree. This album is pretty much balanced.
Are we ready to go to the next one?
Yes, we were dead before the ship even sank. I believe one of the music videos is like directed or helped produced by Heath Ledger or something. I remember that as some random fun fact that they are like friends of the band back in the day. I don't even remember what song it's for, but I think it's for one of the songs of this album.
That's fascinating. And also, they had Johnny Marr, formerly of the Smiths, on guitar in this album, which is very cool.
And just this album, right?
Yep. Which is really weird. I think
fits, because the guitar definitely sounds different than just this album, I think.
Yeah, and this album for me, it's an interesting one. Once again, it has a very specific kind of sound and vibe. I think that each album at this point is very distinct in that way. And this one, they go for a nautical vibe. Instead of it being like trailer trash, it's sailors. And I fucking love that.
It's a fun theme. You can tell that they had a lot of fun with it.
And it fits like a glove.
Concept, I don't think they like completely stick to this for every track, but like the same boat crew is going to die in every single song in a different way, and you kind of get that feeling throughout most, if not all, of this album. Just kind of like a funny, almost hyperbole of the Lonesome Crowd West, where like Lonesome Crowd West was like more autobiographical and like actually accurate in many ways, whereas this just kind of feels like everything, all that kind of existential lonerism is being exaggerated into like being shipfarers at sea.
Yeah, and the video for Dashboard, which I guess is their most successful single, more so than Float On, which I'm very happy about because I love that song.
Yeah, Dashboard is great.
Oh, it's a great cardio track. One of the best.
Yes.
I do that when I hit the punching bag, and it's just Nirvana. But the video for it is just so endearing and fun to me. I love it so much.
Yeah, aren't they at like it's been a while since I've watched the music videos, but aren't they at like some sort of sea shanty bar? There's like a storm going on and all that stuff, or
yeah. So basically, yeah, half of it is it's kind of a frame narrative where Isaac Brock, I'm sorry, Oscar Isaac. That's
Oscar Isaac. Poe Dameron here.
Getting to that point in the night for me where names start to blur together. But
yes.
Isaac Brock is in a sea shanty tavern, and he's telling a story about how he was lost at sea and he was abducted by people who cut his hand off and replaced it instead of with a hook with a microphone. And they're laughing at him and mocking him. They don't believe his story. But then the bartender gets up and he's upset and he rolls his pant leg up. And his leg was replaced. Instead of a peg leg, he has like a guitar neck leg. And it's just such a weird, silly concept. And the aesthetics of it are very Tonight by Smashing Pumpkins, Georges Méliès-esque. And I just have such a fetish for that kind of filmmaking.
That's hilarious. I think with stuff like that, you can tell that they were having a lot of fun with this album.
Oh, yeah. I think, once again, March Into the Sea, once it starts up, it is just immediately hype. They go heavier with this album again. And this is really kind of a mash of their earlier stuff and their newer stuff, which I think mostly works pretty well. And it just... that Dashboard fired up, just firing on all cylinders right at the start, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think that's something that we have agreed on with all of their albums, is that typically they start off really strong. Some of their best tracks, if not the first song, them at least one of the first few songs.
Yeah, and unfortunately, then we get Florida, which for me is the stuff that does not work as well for this album. They do something interesting where they take a lot of inspiration from Talking Heads, and Brock gives very David Byrne-esque vocals at points, which kind of work, but tracks like Florida and especially Fly Trapped in a Jar, which I do like that song, it gets a little too similar to certain Talking Heads tracks. And I feel like they do lose their identity in that influence a little bit, and it does not flow with the rest of the album at all. Even though they're not bad tracks, they don't work in the concept of the album, and honestly, I think they might be better if they were just left as B-sides.
Yeah, I can see that. I think most of the songs where they stick more to the nautical stuff is where, also they are more, I guess, kind of evolving their sound. But I did feel that way. I'm not familiar with Talking Heads, but I did feel that way about like Fly Trapped in a Jar in Florida, is that they felt like they kind of didn't belong, and they're kind of like scattered throughout the album. So it's kind of a weird mix, I think. So the structure is definitely not as strong as like the last album.
Yeah, it still flows pretty well, but it's got those points where it's a little bit of a bumpier ride. With that said, I think Parting of the Sensory is one of my favorite tracks that they've ever done. Lyrics just work for me. The whole thing, just listen to it all the time. I think this is a pretty underrated album for the most part, even though it is uneven. I think Little Motel, Spitting Venom is one of my favorite jam tracks they've done.
Yes.
People as Places as People should have been the last track, but it's still very good.
Yeah, Invisible, it just kind of felt like it was out of order, and that could have been like earlier.
Once again, it felt like a B-side to me, like, because as I recall, the lyrics are basically kind of like Car by Gary Newman, where it's like you think you're invisible in your car, but you're not. And like, it doesn't, like, going from March into the Sea to that doesn't make sense to me. I don't see the transition or the logic to it.
Yeah, like there's not a connecting thread, at least from A to Z.
Yeah, like this album would probably go up a whole like 1.5 for me. No joke. If you got rid of Florida and Invisible. And like Fly Trapped in a Jar, I could live with, because I really like the end of the song where it gets into what's his name, Garrett and stuff like that, the ship crew, and it's naming them, and it gets more typical Modest Mouse. And I love Brock's vocals on Fly Trapped in a Jar, because once again it's very, very Talking Heads. There's a specific track in particular that it's borderline ripping off, but once it goes into its own later on in the track, I think it really is enjoyable.
Right. I have to say, we've got Everything in Education were a couple of my favorite tracks that stuck out to me. Just kind of like very, I don't know, the way I kind of felt like it was like characterizing the sailors as just kind of smug and stubborn. But Education has like a line where it's like, these books sitting on their shelves think they're smarter than me. It just made me laugh. I think they really keep the attitude of kind of like the sailor characters that they've been going with, even if they're less specific on like the actual nautical elements in some of these songs.
Yeah, so in capping, for me, I have to say, I think this is a very solid follow-up to their most popular album. I think it's got a lot of great material, some of their strongest, some of their weakest. Overall, though, it's a really good listen, and it's not their best work, but I still think it's pretty damn good.
Right. I agree. Well, I guess with that, we'll move on to their latest and most recent album, Strangers to Ourselves, which I don't think you hadn't really given a full listen until, what was it, today or just very recently?
Today, actually. Like I said, I'd heard a little bit of it way back when it first dropped, but I mean, it was like 7 years ago, so
I know it's been a
specifically
while, hasn't it?
remembered Coyotes. I remembered the music video especially. I heard some of the tracks, Lampshades on Fire, the title track I had heard live at a performance I was watching, or listening to, I should say, where it happened to be played. But other than that, really not much.
Right. Yeah, I've very much listened to this album a crap ton. So this is kind of like I get to shine with my song knowledge because I like know all the lyrics to every single one of these songs. That's how much I've listened to this album in comparison to the others. That being said, not every song is a winner on this album. There are definitely some that I regularly skip. Like Shit in Your Cut and Pistol are kind of like two duds for me in an otherwise amazing first half to the album. I'm not sure what your thoughts are on the structure or anything like that.
Yeah, it's one that I would have to give a little bit more thought to. In my opinion, like the opening track, and I don't think it's exactly the same, but it reminds me, the opening track kind of reminds me a little bit of, I don't remember the name, but the first actual track on Good News for People Who Love Bad News. It's that kind of thing where it's not heavy on guitars or solos or anything. It's building a story and an atmosphere, and it's a slow burn track.
Into the world at large.
And I think it's a standout on the album personally. And then Lampshades on Fire to me reminded me very much of Dashboard, or one of those style songs.
Yes,
so then,
I agree.
Shit in Your Gut.
Frenetic and very, very frantic.
Yeah, Shit in Your Cut to me felt like it was trying to go back to the Lonesome Crowded West kind of storytelling, where it's a bit more irreverent and lived in. But I agree, it doesn't quite work. I think, I don't know. I definitely know what you mean about it. It is kind of one that I've heard some, I think, 3 times now today. And that was definitely one that felt lesser to me.
Yeah, and it doesn't, even if it's kind of like reminiscent of their older stuff, to me, for what the overall vibe of this album is, I don't think it really fits as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I get what you mean with Pistol as well, where they're kind of more vulgar or violent tracks, but that's not really this album. It's actually a pretty timid album and more restrained for them, I think.
Right. I mean, most of the tracks in this album, this album does have kind of a consistent theme or message about fucking up the planet and how arrogant we are as human beings. And I think even those couple songs that musically don't fit as well for me still kind of like get to that point. It just is a little more jarring than I think a lot of the other songs are in this album. I think their melodies are just very different in this album, which is kind of funny because this is my introduction to the band. So this is what I thought the band was, for years until I kind of explored more.
Yeah, it's very interesting and different than most people. Like I said, it's my introduction to them as well to some extent, but it seems like most people kind of, I don't say gave up on them at this album, but it definitely seems like kind of the least favorite with a lot of fans that I've seen. And for instance,
right, which is funny though, because at the same time, I think this album also brought a lot of new fans on board, especially when you consider the most previous album was 8 years prior. To me, they were like a new band, for instance. So I think that happened with a lot of folks as well, and I think that's what they were trying to go for when they're marketing this album, was trying to get a new crowd following them as well.
Yeah, one thing I think that's interesting that should be addressed is that it's not as erratic or eccentric as past albums. That's not a criticism. I mean, once again, this is eight years since the last album. I mean, this isn't the same man. It's not the same band. I think at this point, a lot of the former band members are no longer in it, to my understanding. I'm no historian or super fan, so don't quote me on that. But like Strangers to Ourselves particularly was jarring in that, and that's not a criticism, I'm just saying it was kind of shocking at how clean the vocals were as compared to past albums.
Right. I have to say, there's a point in this album towards the middle that's got three of my favorite tracks in a row. I think Ansel is very strong. The Ground Walks with Time to Box is my favorite Modest Mouse track. And then I think Coyotes is very strong, but in a very different way.
Yeah, I think Ansel really stands out in the theme of it, especially does. Once again, I'm new to this album, so I might embarrass myself, but Ansel doesn't have kind of like a I'm trying to think of like almost like a Jamaican rock kind of a vibe instrumentally. Or am I thinking of another track? It's not, I'm thinking specifically of the Elton John song "Jamaican Jerk" and that kind of a vibe. If that's with like a Johnny Buffett kind of thing,
Yeah, Ansel is the one where they're singing about
the
his brother having died on like a mountain expedition or something.
Yeah, not knowing the last time you'll see someone and how you wouldn't want to know. Yeah, that one was definitely a standout track for me. And as I recall, it's one of the ones where they really do go for a different kind of sound on the album.
Absolutely. Being said, I was very much introduced to some of their more frenetic stuff, I think, in this album and kind of that. Some of my other favorite songs are Wicked Campaign and The Best Room. I think those are two of the strongest songs on the album as well.
Yeah, I do specifically remember The Best Room. Unfortunately, Wicked Campaign off the top of my head, I can't think of. Is that the one with kind of the circus type keyboard bits?
I think that's Puffs to Dust or Sugar Boats. I think
it's Sugar Boats. I think it's Sugar Boats.
Wicked Campaign is Wicked Campaign starts off very soft and slow, and then eventually reaches the normal Isaac rock frenetic vocals and guitar. Very much kind of a surreal track, and kind of like leads up into Be Brave, which is like the full song. It's kind of frenetic.
Okay. One thing I think is interesting with this album that I don't know if it's intentional is that a lot of it seems to recap lyrics of previous albums. Like they kind of redo the bit from I gotta look up the track now, I'm sorry. But it's from Good News for People Who Live Bad. It's the third Ocean Breeze Salty with I don't know bits. And I think the pre-chorus of that is kind of repeated. God is an Indian and you're an asshole is kind of reminiscent of the God is a woman bits on Moon and Antarctica, as well as kind of some of the Lonesome Crowd Out West kind of things. It almost seems, like I said, Lampshades on Fire seems very much reminiscent of Dashboard. It's interesting because this might end up being the last Modest Mouse album, and to some extent it feels almost intentional, in my opinion.
Right, it's almost like a compilation album, but not for songs, but for like ideas.
Yeah, and it takes me back to like Death Grips, for instance. I almost wish they would have went further with this idea. The band Death Grips, they'll actually remix their own tracks, or like sample their own songs, but completely repurpose them. Or Charlie XCX did that recently with their song Click. And then she had Click 2.0 on her next album that basically remixes that song and repurposes it to an entirely different effect. And I would have been curious to see them play around with that even more and get more collage-esque with it and their backlog, which is a totally different idea than the album. I'm not saying like this wasn't that, therefore this is bad. But it's an interesting idea that I picked up on my first few listens.
Yeah, no, that's very fair. And now knowing their discography more clearly, I can totally see that. It's kind of what they're going for. So I would say, what is your favorite track from this album?
That's a tough one to say so early. I can say the standouts. I'd say Strangers to Ourselves. Ansel lyrically, I don't know so much about musically, and Coyotes would probably be the ones that stand out to me the most. The Best Room, I do remember standing out, but it kind of reminded me of that one. Kind of reminded me of Little Motel from We Were Dead Before the Ship Even Sank, which I think Little Motel is a very endearing little track.
Yeah, I can see that. It definitely got some similar storytelling going on.
But I think the opening track, "Strangers to Ourselves," is probably my favorite. I really like how it uh, builds up, and I think once again they're just consistently. I think we've mentioned every single album has had a very good opener, and this one I don't think is an exception. I don't think it's quite as original as the others. I do think it's kind of reminiscent of "Good News for People with Bad News" and how that opens, but I still think it works, and I think it still kind of feels a little bit unique from the world at large.
Right. I also feel like, of course, we know kind of closes out in a similar way, and I feel like, unlike some of the albums, like that's where the album should end and does end. Um, I think so. There are some songs that kind of are outliers in terms of maybe placement and where they should be in the album, but I think really tie it together at the beginning and just kind of tie it off with a bow at the end, I think, really well.
Yeah, so do you want to rank and rate the albums? Are you ready for that?
Yeah, I think I'm less interested in rating them because, I don't know, rating music for me is kind of difficult because it's, in my opinion, the most subjective art form. But I think maybe just ranking them is to like what our personal favorites are, I think would be interesting.
All right, I'll do both just because I have an interesting thing with my number rankings for some of these.
Yes, you go ahead. It's hard for me to put numbers on albums, I think.
All right, you want me to just go down the list?
Yeah, or you can just rank your albums from like last place to first place, whatever you want to do.
Okay, I'll go first to last. So for me, the number one, I've said this earlier, is Lonesome Crowded West. I've said for years, this is my definitive 9.5 out of 10 album. It is the closest album I think I've ever heard to perfect that isn't perfect. And it's just because it's just a little bit too long, but I've recently upgraded that to a 10 out of 10 because the content's consistently good. And there's never a dip in quality. It's just that eventually it starts to wear on a bit. But that is my favorite album by them. It's, I think, the first, if not the second, I heard in full. And that one is my favorite. After that, I would go the Moon and Antarctica, which I'd probably give a 9 out of 10 to. Really great album, great songwriting. Then This Is a Long Drive. Once again, I'd say like 9 out of 10. Really, I just prefer the Moon and Antarctica. I listen to it more. I think it's a little bit more consistent. After that, I would say Good News for People Who Have Bad News. I give it probably an 8.5 out of 10. I don't think it's quite as good. But I still think it's very strong. It's very catchy and just a fun listen. After that, We Were Dead Before the Ship Even Sank. I give an 8 out of 10 too. Really good when it's on, and when it's off, it's not that bad. But I think that at this point, the band's still experimenting a little bit, but you kind of feel like they've achieved what they're going to achieve. And at this point, it almost seems directionless in where they're headed. I think the sea shanty bits are really fun. I wish they went further with that, but it seems like they're losing some of the focus and vision at this point. And the final one for me would be Strangers to Ourselves. And this one for me, listening to it for the first time, I give it maybe like a 5.5 out of 10. I know a lot of people give it like an F or something like that. I don't think it's that way. To me, it reminds me of a band like The Clash later on in their discography, something like Combat Rock, or not like their worst stuff like Sandinista and all that, where like they start to kind of experiment and do things, but it kind of seems scattershot. I don't quite know what they're going for. And for me, it feels like a band that's already done everything that they're going to do. And I'm not like, I hate this band or they suck now or something like that. But I definitely feel like at this point, they're not pushing themselves. I don't think there's much on this album that hadn't been done before better. And some of the new things they do, I don't particularly feel were steps in the right direction. I don't think the album's necessarily bad, but I don't think it's good.
Right. Well, it's funny that we definitely enjoyed a lot of the same stuff in our discussions, but in terms of our album ranking, it's basically polar opposite. Your least favorite album is my favorite album, and my least favorite album is your favorite album. So my ranking is Strangers to Ourselves, number one. That being said, it's kind of personal bias as well, because of all the albums, it's the only one I've known intimately for 5+ years, whereas all these other ones, mostly listening to in full for the first time, either today or recently. So definitely a huge disparity in perspective there. Strangers to Ourselves I like, and it's refreshing to me knowing their full band stories because they are reinventing themselves. And personally, my affinity for the type of rock that Strangers to Ourselves is a lot higher than, say, the more, like how you said, good irritating of some of the 90s stuff. That's kind of less my jam. So it's really just perspective on that. But seriously, Strangers to Ourselves, I think 8 out of 15 songs are absolute perfect bangers, and some of the other ones less so. But I still always listen to this album in full every time I listen to it. So Strangers to Ourselves is number one. Good News for People Who Love Bad News for me is number two. I think some of the songs on this album are some of their strongest. And like you said, that as a cohesive album, I think it's one of their best works as well. Third for me is the Moon and Antarctica. I think it's their best work of their early stuff. And for me, I'm a sucker for more melody, more instrumentals, which obviously this album is able to deliver on that. And I think just the overall vibe that they're going for is really strong here. Fourth for me is the We Were Dead Before the Ship Even Sank. Really completely agree with most of the things that you said about this album. It's a very fun and cool kind of concept for an album, but I just don't feel like it's as cohesive as some of the rest of the stuff. And then basically, This Is a Long Drive for Someone with Nothing to Think About is the fifth place for me, followed closely in last place by The Lonesome Crowded West, just because I just don't really like the sound of the music that much. And I totally, absolutely respect and understand just the storytelling and the thematics that they go for in these two albums. But just personally listening to it, I find myself wanting to skip more than half the songs. But that's just, my ears are made different. But I still like their whole discography and what the band's been able to accomplish over over 20 years that they've been around now.
Yeah, I think it's been 30. I think it didn't you say the beginning is 1990 they formed or something?
I think it was. I think I read 1992. So yeah, about
Just
30
about.
years, if anything.
That's crazy.
That's a long time. I know. Just sometimes I forget how old some of these what we feel like are newer alt rock bands are. Like, no, they're not new.
Yeah, it's
older
like
than you are.
That trend going
you're
on
in
where
your
it's
20s.
like you think that games 20 years ago look like this, and it's like the first Mario game, but games 20 years ago actually look like this, and it's like PlayStation 2.
Right, exactly. Yeah, we're very much getting to that point in pop culture, I think, for a lot of us. So,
Well,
yeah, man, I'm really interested in seeing if they make another album. I kind of, I don't want it to be a Daft Punk situation where they like retire and it turns out that an album from 8 years ago was their last album. I don't want that to happen to Modest Mouse because I think they'll do something creative and new and fresh again for a seventh album. That being said, I think I really like some of the they return to their roots a little bit, I think, with some of the 2019 singles. You have to give those a listen to.
Yeah, I mean, as far as what I'd like to see from the band in the future, I'm okay with anything. Like I said, if they retired after the Moon and Antarctica or even the Lonesome Crowded West, I mean, you know, a lot of emo bands and stuff like that, which I've never considered Modest Mouse emo, but that's the camp they seem to be lumped into, which whatever.
Right.
If you consider it that, cool. If you don't, whatever. You know, I kind of associate it more with their physical location because I think it goes into that kind of sound more so than that genre of emo. But anyhow, I'm happy with the work they've put out. I'm so grateful for all of it. If they put out another album, I would just want it to be something that is a passion project and is something that is fully realized, which I don't think the band has been doing for quite some time, even though I do like their music from all airs to some degree. So really, I guess I would be perfectly fine if they didn't put out new music if it wasn't right. I'm totally in acceptance. I think they've earned retirement. They've earned their place in the happy aisle. But if they release a new album tomorrow, I would be excited.
I pretty much. I mean, I'm there as well. I definitely don't know what to expect one way or the other. I think they'd be a fun band to see live as well. Yeah. I've seen some of their live performances, and they are pretty damn tight.
Yeah, I've listened to some because I had heard that they got really bad live because the frontman's a notorious alcoholic, and I heard that he just became so drunk all the time that it was just basically unwatchable. But in the footage I've seen, that really wasn't the case at all. But everybody has bad performances. Metallica, who's they're performing well in their 70s or however fucking old they are now, used to be known as Alcoholica because they were too drunk to perform. So every performer has a bad night. I think if the band did record new material, I'd be interested in them going more acoustic, more folk inspired, and it became more of almost a singer-songwriter kind of deal, and just really leaning into that Johnny Cash, Bob Dylan kind of influence with age, I think would be pretty cool.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it'd be interesting to see if they kind of lean more in a folk direction just with their next album if they make it too, because I think that would be really fitting as well.
Yeah, or even Tom Waits, I guess, would be a good comparison. I'd like to see him make a Tom Waits-esque album, which in some ways I think they've already made comparable vibes. My final thing for this episode is a weird anecdote, but Modest Mouse is actually the punchline of one of my least favorite jokes that I've seen in a movie. And it's a good movie, but it just got under my skin how lazy this joke was. It's so weird. But the movie was called Me, Earl, and the Dying Girl. I believe it was made here in Pittsburgh. And someone that I used to know in college actually did the casting for the movie or helped with it. Really talented stunt woman, really cool person. And really fun, good movie. I think very good coming-of-age movie. Very endearing and fun and heartfelt. But there's one line that pisses me off so much where the protagonist of the film meets the female lead's mother, and he says something, and the mother says, "Oh, well, aren't you just a Modest Mouse?" And the male lead says, "Isn't that a band?" And it's so obviously overwritten to get to that punchline where nobody would ever say that in real life.
I was gonna say, that's it. That's horrible.
Yeah, no, it's so awkward and just like forced and lazy. In my opinion, I know some people are offended by the way that the movie portrays cancer and all that. I personally wasn't, but I don't know. I'm open to other perspectives, but I liked the movie quite a bit. I thought it was a good movie. But that one line has stayed with me. I haven't seen this movie in like 7 years. I think I was a junior in college when I saw it, maybe a senior. And that joke just sucks so bad. It stayed with me the whole time.
Yikes. Dialogue is bad if that's like the number one thing you remember years later.
Once again, I'd recommend the movie, but once that scene comes up, maybe put it on mute for a minute or something. Go to the bathroom.
All right. Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's miserable. Hopefully Modest Mouse gets their documentary on the House of Mouse very soon.
Yeah, for now, check out the one already existing on YouTube.
Yeah, exactly. We've already made a little documentary here ourselves. We thank you guys for listening. If you guys want us to review more music in the future that Todd and I both know about, we'll see. It'll be fun.
For now, I'm Todd Crawford.
I'm Eric Zavinski.
We are Too Cool for the Comic Shop.